Hello, good morning. Good morning. I think I'm not like the person who should give this talk because I'm not ready for production myself. Um, Today, I actually came here to ask you this question. Hey, are you ready for production? It turned out to be a self-deprecating joke, I guess. Before getting to that question, I just want to see some hands. Can you even tell if you can answer this question? Very few hands. Yeah, that's normal. I actually, as a side note, I'm working for Google, but some of the practices I will explain you today are from our practices. But these are like more industry-wide practices and tools. So aside production, I first need to explain my emotional state about production. I think for a very long time, production has always been a scary word to me. Who's maintaining production services here? A lot of hands. Who feels nervous when pushing new stuff to production or launching a new service? Again, plenty of hands, and that's normal, although it's not ideal. Production is the environment we often end up having some anxiety, especially if you're working for the wrong company with the wrong tools and the wrong practices. Production can be an intimidating place if you're a new beginner in the industry. If you don't have any experience, you feel like you may feel judged if you fail. And I was not the person I always was today. For many years, our production environments have always been so intimidating for me that I always try to stay away, even though they are very critical. And that's like a terrible cycle, right? You don't want to touch to something critical, but you know that it's critical. So when you're involved in activities with production, there are a lot of questions you have. The first question, obvious, is when you're launching, especially a new service, are you ready to push the things to production? And then how can you tell what is good or bad? Or how can you tell who is to determine who is bad and what is good or bad to do in production? How do we transfer knowledge? It's not just like when things go wrong. If things are successful, you also want to be able to transfer that knowledge so it's repeated. And how do we learn from failure, right? What is the best way? What is the best channel? Because of all these questions and the anxiety nature of it, it turns out to be an intimidating place. And sometimes you're consumed by the production anxiety. A while ago, I've been introduced to this concept called production readiness and some reviews. This is actually a very simple practice that ensures two things. The first one is a service should meet some standards of operational readiness. And the second thing is teams can benefit from this organization-wide knowledge share through the readiness. And the production readiness practices come in with a review system, which are called PRRs. And I'll talk a little bit about both of them. So we ideally think that the reviews can be done not only for once, but for many times in the life cycle of a service. I think the first one mentioned here is very obvious. When you're launching a new production service, yes, you want to take a look and review if it's ready for production. The second case is when you're introducing production readiness to an existing service. It's also very obvious because you want to review if they're ready for production. But they're also useful when you're handing off the operations to a different team, or when you're handing off operations to new individuals on your team, when you're onboarding people. It would be nice to be able to see, hey, if this service is really meeting with our standards, and you can just make sure that everybody speaks the same language and everybody's on the same page by doing the review. The other case is when you're preparing on-call support, especially if this is requiring collaboration with other teams, as well as some wider collaboration from the company. You can still sit down and review what is there. So I mentioned the reviews is a part of this practice, and reviews can often be expressed as some sort of checklist. This checklist, for example, is a very high-level overview. It touches a bunch of subcategories. It tells you a bunch of things that you can do at design, development. These are the things that you should do for configuration, release management, and so on. You may have more topics, or you may have less topics. And I will pretty soon explain, give you some concrete examples of what can be put in a checklist. But first, let me briefly discuss why these reviews are useful. So the first thing is companies often end up having practices around production in a very organic way. You start a company, it just grows eventually. There are different teams doing different things. Each team is trying to figure out what is the best practice with trial and error most of the case. And this reality often has a cost. Just because everybody's trying to do it with trial and error, it creates this culture where there's more blame. So people are looking for it doesn't really, it kind of is working against the confidence of the practitioners because everything is by trial and error. Also, engineers don't feel, confident enough to push to production, which is affecting the release velocity. And this, both trial and error culture causing fingerprinting, and that anxiety of having to fail is not really ideal. So production readiness is not a very magic tool, but it actually helps. Reviews can be a checklist or a questionnaire that as I explained. They can be done manually or automatically. In most cases, people try to do them both. There are some tedious stuff that you can look for. You can do them automatically, or there are a lot of complex things you might be looking for, and you can do them manually. Organizations can produce a checklist template rather than giving people a static list of things. So each team can inherit some knowledge by taking the template, but they can also have the flexibility of adding new items that are relevant to them. Now I want to show you a checklist and give you some examples of what can be put there, but please see this as a reference. This is not the ultimate thing or whatever. It's just some sort of an influence and showing you what is the format and what could be there. In fact, a while ago, I published something very similar as a guideline for Google Cloud customers. So as a service provider, it's very interesting for us because there are all these gaps, in knowledge when it comes to production practices, and there's not a good way for us to present it. We need to sometimes give some tool or product suggestions, but there's not easy way to explain the broader picture. So this production guideline is kind of helping our customers to see, oh, these are the critical things that you should go through and consider. So even though I kept talking in the scope of a single organization or a company, these checklists can be actually useful across the companies. Let's start digging into a example checklist. So I said that there could be multiple categories. Design and development is one of them. This is where you can say all of your best practices. Have reproducible builds, SLOs. You're giving people the guidance what they should do at design and development. And this section ideally really helps the development team to make better design decisions. And if you can actually help them with the trade-offs and everything, people love it. So the list actually looks more of this. You have these different items, but each of them has more of a section where you explain why this best practice is around. This is the rationale. This is the historical reason why we ended up doing this. And then on top of that, for each item, you usually provide some deliverables. For this type of project, let's please make sure that this is done, and the second thing is done, and the third thing is done. So you don't necessarily just give them a simple list. You also provide people rational and deliverables, so they're actionable, and there is historical knowledge. This is a section for configuration. There's a lot of debates around whether to use flags or environmental variables or configuration management tools. This is a place where you can express the best practice. It's simple best practices, small, static, non-secret configuration can be flags. Everything else should come from the configuration management. For a new person who's just coming to your company, doesn't need to know about this, but they can go through this list to understand what's going on. You can explain what is static or what is dynamic, what development environment configuration should do with the production one to avoid like misuses and so on. So it's a good place to represent all of that. Release management can touch a bunch of things, but they're usually touching the fundamentals. Document things, including your canary releases and how to, revert canaries. Make sure you don't use a different process for rollout compared to like rollback. So, they should go through the same pipeline. For a newcomer, it might be this might not be obvious, but once you're represented here, everybody has to go through the same practice. Observability is a huge topic, but you can put some pointers here. Even for people who absolutely no understanding, they can have like enough, they can see the initial pointers. A very common example of this is, for example, lots of people haven't heard about distributed tracing, but you have to at least like propagate the incoming tracing header in order to make the entire thing work. If you put it in the checklist here, you don't necessarily have to know about it, but you can read about it, and it's a really good pointer. Security is a huge topic, but high-level overview and policies can be represented here. Maybe they can act as like some of the the pointers. You can say how you should encrypt the traffic. You can say like how you should isolate resources, or how to monitor user data lookups, or how to limit access to a bunch of things. Even though it's pretty obvious, we commonly know. And quite of an example of this is, a lot of times people forget that like debugging endpoints require a different, ACL, and it's just so much easier when you put this on the list. So it's a reminder for you. Even though we all know that like it's really obvious in common practice, we usually forget about them. So it goes to the checklist. Again, you can mention about input sanitization. You can talk about payload restrictions. You can make sure that like you can block the incoming traffic by user and so on. All these like other cases that contributes to abuse can be put here because some of them are actual design time decisions. You have to really be prepared and design things in a specific way. Capacity planning is one of them. Nobody really documents, but checklist is a good way to do this. And it's capacity planning is really crucial for the sustainability of your service. So document resource requirements, document limitations, document the need for the load testing and what it takes to load test if you care about load testing. If you like the idea of readiness, the next step is, I think, where you want to start. The first thing is, I think, acknowledging this as a team. The solo attempts are likely to fail because this is more of like a team-wide, practice. So try to acknowledge the need as a team and try to do something about it. The second thing, you can start to research practices that apply to you. You can take a look at the reference tools or checklists like that I shared. But you can also consult your domain experts, especially if you have a specific, expertise in a specific domain. It's really important to, I think, involve some of the experts early in. Start having production readiness discussions as soon as you start actually designing the system. Because if you introduce this type of practices as a later time exercise, I think they're seen as a burden. If you involve them early, it really helps people to do the right decisions. Try to learn from failure and share knowledge directly. This is a way to, the checklists are a way to deliver knowledge. They are a channel to deliver the knowledge. And when you're acknowledging the need as a team, I think this is one of the strongest points. And if possible, try to enforce production readiness practices all across so everybody speaks the same language. There's one more thing. Please don't stop evaluating the review process. Review and iterate each item, even the process itself. When adding new items to the review, always provide the rationale, as I have shown an example. Remove the items if they're not relevant at all. And always feel free to ask for assistance to review the reviews itself. So you get different opinions and share more of like, the industry-wide knowledge through this way. Production readiness should be discussed when you are initially designing a new service. It's often becoming a burden if you try to comply with these practices at a later time. So checklists should provide insights, to engineers to make the right decisions. So try to do this early as possible. Try to include them in the design docs as well. One of the fair concerns from everyone is like, hey, this is like additional process and it's actually going to work against us. When implemented carefully, it shouldn't. Readiness should really increase your velocity because, it's helping with design and development. The second thing is, when you're troubleshooting, you actually have a better understanding of what is already there, and you are following some of the practices that will help with your troubleshooting. And the third one is, when others are joining to your team, you're just handing off responsibilities to a different team. You actually have like some sort of, they know what is there. So it really helps the knowledge transfer to different teams as well. So to recap, we realized that production readiness helps teams to be more confident, reduce everyday mistakes, and help onboarding new individuals. We don't really see people, saying, I know what I'm doing, but, the checklist can actually like help them to feel a little bit more confident about what they do. And because they understand the success and they understand the fail modes better. You can do the review either manually or automatically. As I said, it's not always possible to do everything automatically, so try to do all the tedious things automatically and do the other stuff manually. If you don't reduce this bothersome repetitive tasks, I think people end up abandoning these practices because it's sort of like some additional, there's not much value maybe coming from them. Like they see that it's so much work, so much process, and there's not much value coming from them. So making it less tedious is very important. When introduced as a later time policy or compliance, this is really making it harder for everyone. Instead, try to do it as early as possible. You should really make everyone to, you should help people with the design trade-offs. So, if the reviews can help them practically in the life cycle of the entire thing, people love them, people like them, and don't like to abandon them. It is really important concern to understand that readiness could be a process burden, so try to measure it. We often say that like, oh, if the maturity is higher, the release velocity is going to get higher, but try to measure it. The cost of having no readiness reviews is not ideal either. Repeated mistakes and missing knowledge gaps can be improved significantly with this thing. And repeated mistakes is also like creating this trial error culture where it contributes to more of like a blameful engineering culture. So give this a try and try to see how it's actually impacting you. Most importantly, this is not about just like checks in some boxes. This is not about adding some process. This is about sharing knowledge. By reading production readiness checklist, I've learned a lot about a team. I learned a lot about an organization. It actually gives me a way to say that like I really want to work with this team or not sometimes. So it's just more about then checking some boxes. Try to keep the process also lightweight as possible. As I said, that try to measure it. Just like in everything else, abandon it if you don't find any clear value for your specific case. Because otherwise, people are likely to see readiness nothing but an arbitrary process that adds nothing but some additional cost. Production readiness can be a powerful tool, if you ask me, when you implement it carefully. So try to consider it. That's all I have for today. Thanks for joining. I'm wishing you a happy production. Try to wash your hands. And I'm so sorry for not being production ready.